The first probe reached Earth on a Tuesday, though the Dravosi had no word for Tuesday and no concept of a week that short. Grand Strategos Vaeltharin's great-great predecessor, a cold and calculating insectoid named Drethel, stood on the observation deck of a ship parked behind Jupiter's fourth moon and watched the blue planets spin like a marble someone had dropped and forgotten about. "Catalog everything," Drethel ordered, and they did. The Dravosi were not a species that rushed into anything, and that was the thing that made them terrifying across 11 star systems. The thing that made civilization surrender before the first ship even entered orbit, because everyone in the galaxy knew that when the Dravosi came for you, they had already won. They had already mapped your rivers and counted your soldiers and predicted which of your generals would betray you first. And the invasion itself was just a formality, a rubber stamp on a decision made decades ago. Before you ever knew they were watching, So they watched Earth. They watched the humans fight each other, which happened with a frequency that made the observation team file 3 separate reports, asking if the species was in a permanent state of civil war. They watched the humans split the atom, and then instead of putting the technology away, like any sane civilization would, they built enough bombs to glass their own planet 14 times over, and then went back to arguing about what to put on sandwiches. They watched the humans go to their own moon, a feat that should have taken them another century based on the Dravosi developmental models, and they did it with computers less powerful than the device they would later use to share pictures of their food. Drethel logged a note in the observation file that would be passed down through 4 generations of command. This species is fragmented, undisciplined, and prone to irrational violence against its own kind. This is their weakness. Every Strategos after him read that note. Every Strategos after him believed it. The plan grew the way a cathedral grows, one stone at a time across lifetimes, and the Dravosi were patient the way a glacier is patient, not because they chose patience, but because they were incapable of imagining any other way to do things. 30 years into the observation, they had mapped every military base on Earth, every nuclear silo, every naval fleet and its patrol routes, and they had done this without a single human ever looking up and noticing, which was both impressive and, in a way the Dravosi did not recognize, a little bit sad, because the humans were so busy watching each other that they never thought to watch the sky. 50 years in, the War Council, a hive body of 17 linked minds called the Chorus, approved the preliminary invasion architecture, a document so detailed it specified which Earth cities would fall in which order and how many seconds each phase would take. The document was 11,000 pages long. It was, by any objective measure, a masterpiece of strategic planning, a thing of terrible beauty, the kind of war plan that other species would study for centuries as the pinnacle of military science. It was also, though nobody in the chorus would ever know this, completely and spectacularly wrong. But that part comes later. 60 years in, the Dravosi began building the fleet, and not just any fleet, but the fleet, the one designed with such precision that every ship had a specific role in a specific moment, at a specific coordinate, above a specific city. And the shipyards burned bright in the Dravosi home system for decades as 12,000 vessels took shape in the dark between stars. 80 years in, Vaeltharin was born. He came into the world with 6 legs and compound eyes that could see in 11 spectra, and a genetic lineage that had been centuries in the making, steering toward this single moment for 4 generations, and he was raised not as a child but as a key, shaped and filed and polished to fit one lock, and that lock was Earth. He learned the plan before he learned language. By the time he could speak, he could recite the orbital insertion vectors for every ship in the fleet. He could name every human military installation from memory. He could predict the response time of 37 different national armies down to the minute. His teachers called him perfect, His handlers called him ready. He called himself within parameters, a phrase he repeated like a prayer, like a heartbeat, like the only truth he had ever needed. And if you had told him that those two words would become the epitaph of the greatest military failure in galactic history, he would have stared at you with those 11 spectrum eyes and not understood what you meant. Because Vale Tharin was brilliant and disciplined and ruthless, prepared in every way that a century of observation could make someone prepared. And he was missing the one thing that would have saved him. He was missing the imagination to be afraid. 95 years in, the fleet conducted final simulations, 14 million scenarios run through the most advanced predictive models ever built by any species in the known galaxy, and the results came back clean, green across the board, a 99.97% probability of total conquest within 72 hours. The chorus reviewed the results and issued their formal blessing. Vale Tharin stood on the bridge of the flagship, a vessel named Certainty in the Dravosi tongue, which tells you everything you need to know about how they saw themselves. And he looked at the holographic display, showing Earth and its 7 billion inhabitants, and he felt nothing that resembled doubt. The fleet launched on what the humans would have called a Wednesday. 12,000 ships, each one a floating cathedral of engineered death, slipped out of the Dravosi home system in perfect formation and aimed themselves at a small blue world that had no idea they were coming. The journey took 4 months. During that time, Vale Tharin reviewed the plan 612 times. He found 0 errors. He found 0 surprises. He found 0 reasons to deviate from a single line of the 11,000-page document that his species had spent a century writing. And on the bridge of the Certainty, with Earth growing larger in the forward display like a pupil dilating in the dark, Vale Tharin allowed himself a rare moment of something that, in a species capable of feeling it, might have been called pride. Within parameters, he said to no one. The bridge crew clicked their mandibles in agreement. Earth hung in the viewport, blue and white and green, full of people drinking coffee and arguing about politics, and posting pictures of their dogs, and falling in love, and breaking each other's hearts, and building things in garages that no rational species would ever think to build. Pover, none of them looked up. Pover, not yet. The sky broke at 9:47 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, which meant it was lunchtime in London and the middle of the night in Tokyo. And this mattered because the Dravosi had timed their arrival so that the maximum number of military command centers would be in transition between shifts. That level of detail, knowing when human soldiers changed shifts, should tell you everything about how seriously they had taken this. Vale Tharin stood at the center of the bridge, aboard the Certainty, and watched 12,000 ships decloak in perfect synchronization across 6 continents. And the word perfect is not used loosely here. The timing variance between the first ship and the last was less than 3 nanoseconds, which is the kind of precision that turns warfare into clockwork. Phase 1, he said. The electromagnetic suppression wave hit Earth like a silent scream. Satellites died in orbit, hundreds of them, blinking out like birthday candles. The International Space Station went dark and began to drift, and across the planet, communication networks collapsed in a cascade that the Dravosi tactical models had predicted down to the order in which individual cell towers would fail. Television screens went black. Radios hissed static. The Internet, that strange and chaotic web that the Dravosi had spent decades studying with a mixture of fascination and disgust, went silent. Vale Tharin watched his displays, green across every sector, every metric within the acceptable range, and he allowed his mandibles to relax into the position his species used to express satisfaction. Within parameters, he said. 7,000 miles below and slightly to the left, Sergeant Maya Reyes was standing in the parking lot of the Marine Corps base at Camp Pendleton, California, holding a paper cup of coffee that she had waited 14 minutes for because the machine in the mess hall was broken again. Walk to the one near the motor pool, which always tasted like it had been filtered through a transmission, but at least it was hot. She was thinking about absolutely nothing important when the sky above the Pacific Ocean split open like a wound, and a ship the size of a shopping mall descended through the clouds with a sound like God clearing his throat. Maya looked at the ship. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the ship again. She took a sip. "Well, that's new," she said to no one in particular. Across the base, alarms were screaming, and people were running, and someone was shouting about getting to the armory. And Maya stood in the parking lot for another 3 seconds, because she had learned a long time ago, in a place she did not talk about, that the first person to panic is the first person to die. She finished her sip. She set the coffee on the hood of a Humvee with the careful precision of someone who fully intended to come back for it. Then she moved. On the bridge of the Certainty, Veiltharin watched the ground invasion begin, and it was beautiful in the way that only total control can be beautiful. The dropships descending in geometric patterns that the Dravosi had rehearsed for decades. Each one carrying shock troops bred for exactly this gravity, this atmosphere, this resistance level. The shock troops were magnificent, 8-foot bioengineered soldiers with acid glands in their forearms and gravity dampeners in their chest cavities that could deflect projectile weapons, because the Dravosi had studied human firearms extensively and had built their soldiers to be immune to bullets in the same way you might build a raincoat to be immune to water. They landed in formation. They advanced in formation. They expected to encounter scattered resistance from confused and leaderless human soldiers, stumbling around in the dark without their precious technology. Minutes. That is exactly what happened. In Seoul, a South Korean rapid response unit fired on a Dravosi column and watched their bullets bounce off the gravity dampeners like pebbles off a tank. In Berlin, German soldiers scrambled from their barracks into a city that had gone dark, radios dead, chain of command severed, and they did what soldiers without orders have done since the beginning of time. They stood there and waited for someone to tell them what to do. In London, Parliament went into emergency lockdown, which meant a lot of very important people were now trapped in a very old building doing absolutely nothing useful. Veiltharin tracked all of this from his bridge and watched his probability models hold steady like a heartbeat on a monitor, green and rhythmic and calm. "Resistance is fragmented," his tactical officer reported, clicking through data streams with 4 arms working simultaneously. "Human command and control networks are 94% disabled. Ground force casualties are within projected tolerance. Civilian population is exhibiting standard fear flight response across all major urban centers." "Within parameters," Veiltharin said. And it was, for 2 minutes, it was. Maya Reyes reached the armory in 40 seconds, because she did not run in a straight line, and she did not wait for anyone to open doors for her, and she did not stop when a chunk of concrete the size of a refrigerator landed 8 feet to her left, thrown from a building that one of the alien ships had clipped on its way down. She grabbed her rifle, an M27 that she had cleaned so many times she could do it blindfolded, and she grabbed 4 magazines, and she grabbed a portable launcher that she was technically not certified to use, and she shoved 2 protein bars in her vest pocket because she had a feeling this was going to be a long morning. Her squad found her outside the armory, 5 of them, wide-eyed, breathing hard and looking at her like she was supposed to know what to do about the alien invasion happening on their doorstep. She did not know what to do about the alien invasion happening on their doorstep. But she knew how to move, and she knew how to shoot, and she knew that standing still was dying slow. And those 3 things had kept her alive through worse days than this. "On me," she said, and they moved. On the bridge of the Certainty, a small light blinked amber on the edge of Veiltharin's tactical display. It was a single anomalous reading from the North American theater, a weapons signature that did not match any entry in the Dravosi database. and the database contained every weapon signature humanity had produced in the last 100 years. His tactical officer flagged it. The ship's AI processed it for 1.4 seconds and categorized it as a sensor malfunction caused by atmospheric interference from the electromagnetic suppression wave. Veiltharin looked at the amber light. It was small. It was singular. It was the first thing in 100 years of observation, planning, and preparation that the Dravosi could not immediately explain. He should have felt something in that moment. Some flicker of uncertainty. Some cold whisper in the back of his tactical mind that said, maybe, just maybe, the 11,000-page plan had a hole in it. But the Dravosi did not build their commanders to feel uncertainty. They built them to trust the model. Sensor error, the tactical officer confirmed. Acknowledged, Veiltharin said, and dismissed the light, and turned back to his displays, green and steady and sure. Below him, on a planet that was supposed to be falling exactly as predicted, Maya Reyes led her squad into positions that did not exist in any tactical manual, through a gap in the alien perimeter that did not exist in any Dravosi model, fight that no probability simulation had ever imagined. And she was not the only one. Across 6 continents, in bases and bunkers and bedrooms and barns, humans were picking up weapons and tools and car keys and kitchen knives and anything heavy enough to throw. And they were not waiting for orders, and they were not following protocols, and they were not doing a single thing that the Dravosi had predicted they would do. The amber light on Veiltharin's display went dark. He did not think about it again. He would think about it later, in the long dark silence of retreat, when he had nothing left to do but think about every small thing he had ignored. But that was 8 minutes from now. And 8 minutes, as he was about to learn, is a very long time on Earth. 2 minutes and 30 seconds into the invasion of Earth, a National Guard unit in the Nevada desert did something impossible. They were pinned behind a row of burned-out trucks on a highway outside Reno. 14 soldiers, who had been on a routine supply run 20 minutes ago, and were now pressed flat against asphalt that was already hot from Dravosi plasma scoring. And their rifles were doing exactly nothing, because every round they fired bounced off the alien gravity dampeners like they were throwing grapes at a brick wall. Their sergeant, a man named Cowell, who had a mustache that violated 3 different regulations and a voice like a diesel engine turning over, was on a radio that should not have been working, because the electromagnetic suppression wave had killed everything electronic within 200 miles. But this radio was not standard issue. This radio was connected to a weapons platform that had been parked in a bunker under the desert floor for exactly 6 months, a platform that existed in no official document, that had been built by a team of engineers who technically worked for a company that technically did not exist, funded by a budget line that was labeled office supplies in the Pentagon's books. Cowell did not know what the weapon was called. He did not know how it worked. He knew the frequency to call, and he knew the words to say. And when the voice on the other end asked him to confirm the target coordinates, he read them off a cracked GPS unit that he had duct-taped to his vest that morning because the mounting bracket was broken and he had not gotten around to filing a requisition form. 3 seconds after he finished reading the numbers, a beam of light came down from a structure buried in the mountainside that looked like a cell tower if you didn't look too closely. And it hit the Dravosi column with the sound of the sky tearing in half. The column ceased to exist. Exploded. Not scattered, not damaged. Ceased to exist, the way a word ceases to exist when you erase it from a page, completely and totally and without residue. 9 seconds from activation to silence. Cowell stared at the empty stretch of highway where 30 alien shock troops had been standing. "Copy that," he said into the radio, and his voice did not shake, which was a lie his body was telling on behalf of his brain, which was screaming. On the bridge of the certainty, 700 miles above the Nevada desert, Vale Theron watched an entire tactical unit vanish from his display. Not retreat, not disperse, vanish, the way a candle flame vanishes when you close your fist around it. His tactical officer made a sound that Dravasi made when their models encountered data that did not fit inside any existing category. A high-pitched clicking that roughly translated to "this does not compute," but carried the emotional weight of a mathematician watching. 2 + 2 = something that was not 4, and never would be again. What weapon system produced that result? Vale Theron said, and it was not a question, it was a demand. Unknown, the tactical officer said. Cross-reference with the database. Already completed. No match exists. The energy signature does not correspond to any human weapons technology in our records. Vale Theron's compound eyes focused on the empty space on his display where his soldiers had been. And for 1/2 of 1 second, something moved behind those eyes that was not calculation, and was not strategy, and was not anything his training had prepared him for. Then he buried it. Isolated incident, he said. Continue the advance. It was not an isolated incident. At minute 3 in a suburb outside of Tokyo that the Dravosi had designated as a low-resistance civilian zone, a Japanese self-defense force unit that had lost contact with Command 45, seconds after the invasion began, did something that the Dravosi tactical models had classified as statistically impossible. They adapted. Not in hours, not in days, in seconds, in the time it took their sergeant to watch one volley of rifle fire bounce harmlessly off the alien shock troops, and say a single word in Japanese that roughly translated to "fine," but carried the weight of an entire nation's stubbornness. They stopped shooting at the bodies. They started shooting at the ground beneath the aliens' feet. Because the gravity dampeners only protected against incoming projectiles, and the ground was not an incoming projectile. And when the asphalt under a shock trooper's feet exploded upward, it did not trigger the dampener, and the trooper went down hard, and the dampener could not protect something that was already on the ground. It was not elegant. It was not in any manual. A sergeant in a suburb figured it out in less time than it takes to boil an egg, and within 90 seconds, every JSDF unit in the region was doing the same thing. On the bridge, another red light, then another, then 6 more. Vale Theron's display, which had been a calm sea of green for the first 2 minutes of the invasion, was beginning to bloom with amber and red, like bruises forming on skin. At minute 4, the civilians entered the war. This was not in the plan. The 11,000-page document had an entire section on civilian behavior, 240 pages of detailed predictions based on a century of observation, and every single prediction boiled down to the same conclusion. Civilians flee, civilians panic, civilians are a logistical nuisance, but not a tactical threat. The document did not have a section for what happened in Houston, Texas, where a man named Dale Hendricks, who owned a ranch and a machine shop, and a .50 caliber rifle that he had mounted on the back of his truck because he lived in Texas, and that was apparently a thing you could do there, drove his truck into the middle of a Dravosi patrol and opened fire at a range so close the gravity dampeners could not cycle fast enough to compensate. The document did not have a section for what happened in Helsinki, Finland, where a woman named Elsa Korhonen, who had grown up on a frozen lake and knew its ice the way a surgeon knows the human body, led a column of alien ground troops onto a section of surface that she knew, with the certainty of 40 winters, would not hold their weight. They fell through. 11 shock troops, each one the product of decades of genetic engineering, drowned in 4 feet of Finnish lake water, because nobody on an alien warship had thought to check the ice thickness of Scandinavian lakes in February. The document did not have a section for what happened in Seoul, South Korea, where a 17-year-old girl, whose name would later be classified by 3 different intelligence agencies, opened a live stream on a gaming platform that the electromagnetic pulse had somehow failed to kill, because the server was in a basement in Busan, that was shielded by 6 feet of concrete, and the Korean internet was built on a backbone of fiber optic cables that did not care about electromagnetic suppression, and she began broadcasting the positions of every alien unit she could see from her apartment window. Within 90 seconds, 40,000 people were watching. Within 3 minutes, her stream had been picked up by what remained of the South Korean military's communication network. And soldiers who had been fighting blind were now receiving real-time tactical intelligence from a teenager using a platform designed for people to watch each other play video games. Vaeltherin stared at his display. The green was almost gone now. The amber was spreading. The red was growing. His probability models, the ones that had been built over 100 years by the finest strategic minds his species had ever produced, were collapsing in on themselves like a building that had just learned its foundation was made of paper. Recalculate, he ordered. The tactical AI recalculated. The new probability of successful conquest had dropped from 99.97% to 61% in 4 minutes. Recalculate again, he said. The AI ran the numbers again, and this time the probability dropped to 44%, because in the time it took to run the calculation, humans had adapted again. Somewhere, in some way, the models could not predict. And the models could not predict it, because the models were built on the assumption that human behavior was a function of human capability, and human capability was a fixed variable. It was not a fixed variable. It had never been a fixed variable. That was the thing the Dravosi had gotten wrong, the one foundational error. Buried under 100 years of perfect data, the crack in the cathedral that brought the whole thing down. They had studied what humans were. They had never understood what humans become. Vaeltherin pulled up the original observation notes, the ones written by Dreffel 100 years ago, and he scrolled to the line that every Strategos had read and believed, and built a war plan on top of, like a house built on a grave. This species is fragmented, undisciplined, and prone to irrational violence against its own kind. This is their weakness. He read it again. The word irrational sat on the screen like a bomb that had been ticking for a century, because irrational meant unpredictable, and unpredictable meant unmodelable, and unmodelable meant the last 100 years of work, the 11,000-page plan, the 12,000-ship fleet, the 4 generations of preparation. All of it was built on a foundation that assumed you could predict what a human would do if you watched them long enough. And you could not. You never could. The Dravosi had conquered 11 star systems using the same method: watch, model, predict, execute. And it had worked every single time, because every species they had ever encountered behaved according to observable patterns. Humans did not behave according to observable patterns. Humans behaved according to something the Dravosi did not have a word for, something that lived in the gap between what a person was and what a person chose to become when everything they loved was on fire. Vaeltherin closed the observation notes. His mandibles were locked tight against his face. Within parameters, he said, but his voice had changed, and everyone on the bridge heard it, and nobody believed it, and the word parameters hung in the recycled air of the flagship, like a prayer offered to a god that had already left the building. At minute 6, Vaeltherin realized the humans had not used their nuclear weapons. He stood on the bridge of the certainty and stared at his display and waited for the nuclear launches that his models had predicted would begin between minute 4 and minute 7. The desperate last resort strikes that every cornered civilization eventually reaches for. The planet-scarring tantrums that would give the Dravosi fleet the moral justification to escalate to orbital bombardment and end the whole thing from above. The launches did not come. He checked the display again. The silos were active. He could see that much. The human nuclear infrastructure was still partially operational, despite the electromagnetic suppression, which was itself a surprise, but a minor one. The kind of thing the models allowed for. The weapons were ready. The humans were choosing not to use them. This was the moment Viltharin's thorax went cold, a deep biological chill that his species experienced only in the presence of something their instincts recognized as fundamentally dangerous. And it was not the weapons that frightened him, it was the restraint. A species that had the ability to burn its own world to ash rather than let someone else take it, and chose not to, was not a species acting out of desperation. It was a species that believed it had better options. And a species that believed it had better options at minute 6 of an alien invasion was a species that was not losing. They are not using their strategic weapons, his tactical officer said, and there was something in the officer's voice that sounded like the Dravasi equivalent of a man who has just realized the animal he thought was sleeping is actually watching him. I can see that, Viltharin said. The models predicted nuclear deployment by... I know what the models predicted. Silence on the bridge. Red P. At minute 7, the flagship was boarded. This was not supposed to be possible. The Certainty was in low orbit, protected by 3 concentric rings of escort vessels and a point defense network that could track and destroy any object larger than a baseball, moving faster than a bullet. And the Dravosi had specifically designed this defense grid to counter every known human launch vehicle, every rocket, every missile, every piece of orbital hardware that humanity had put into space in the last century. They had not designed it to counter the thing that came through the defense grid at minute 7, because the thing that came through the defense grid at minute 7 did not exist 4 months ago. It was a spacecraft, technically, in the same way that a skateboard is technically a vehicle. It was a single-pilot craft about the size of a delivery van, built by a private aerospace company that had been founded 9 years ago by a woman who had gotten bored of building electric cars, and it had been in the testing phase when the invasion began, sitting in a hangar in the Mojave Desert, with half its systems still running on prototype firmware. The pilot's name was Dr. Ananya Metha. She was 34 years old. She had a PhD in aerospace engineering and a minor in classical piano, and she had been eating a granola bar when the sky broke open, and her test flight suddenly became the most important thing any human being had ever done. She flew the craft through the defense grid by doing something that the Dravosi point defense system could not process. She flew erratically, not in the smooth, predictable arcs that the targeting algorithms were calibrated for, but in jagged, jerking, seemingly random patterns that she was actually calculating on the fly based on the firing rhythm of the point defense guns, which she could see because the craft had a sensor suite that was designed for asteroid mapping and worked just as well for tracking incoming fire. She should not have been able to do this. The math should not have worked. It worked because she was very good at math and very bad at knowing when something was impossible. And those two qualities together are the most dangerous thing in the universe. She hit the flagship's docking bay at an angle that crumpled the nose of her craft and sent her helmet bouncing off the control panel hard enough to crack the visor. And she sat in the wreckage for 2 seconds, catching her breath, and then unbuckled her harness and pulled a fire extinguisher from the emergency kit. Because she did not have a weapon, and a fire extinguisher was heavy, and she was an engineer. And engineers solve problems with whatever is in the room. The Dravosi security team that arrived at the docking bay 30 seconds later was not prepared for a woman with a fire extinguisher. And the calm of someone who had decided this was just a really aggressive thesis. At minute 8, the cascade began. The Dravosi fleet was a masterpiece of coordination. 12,000 ships linked through a quantum communication network that allowed the chorus, the hive mind war council, to issue orders to every vessel simultaneously. And this network was their greatest strength, the thing that let them move as one organism across the void of space with a precision no other species could match. It was also, as it turned out, their greatest weakness. Because when the command ships began to fall, not all of them, not even most of them, just enough of them in just the right sequence, the network did not degrade gracefully. It shattered. The Dravosi had not built redundancy into their command structure because they had never needed redundancy. Because in 11 previous conquests, nothing had ever damaged their command ships. Because no species had ever gotten close enough to try. And so, the network was designed for perfection, and perfection does not have a backup plan, because perfection does not imagine failure. Ship after ship lost contact with the chorus. Ship after ship defaulted to pre-programmed protocols that assumed the battle was going according to plan. Ship after ship continued executing Phase 1, while the actual battle had moved to something that did not have a phase number, because it was not in the plan. Humans, by contrast, had been fighting without reliable communications for 6 minutes, and had only gotten more coordinated. This was the part that broke Viltharin's understanding of the universe. He had been taught from birth that coordination required control, that control required communication, that communication required hierarchy, and that hierarchy required obedience, and this chain of logic was so fundamental to the Dravasi worldview that questioning it would have been like questioning gravity. Humans did not coordinate through obedience. They coordinated through something else, something the Dravosi did not have a word for, because they had never needed one. Trust. Not trust in the plan, not trust in the hierarchy, but trust in each other, in the sergeant next to you, in the stranger with the rifle, in the 17-year-old girl on the gaming stream, in the pilot with the fire extinguisher. Trust that the person next to you would do something useful, even if you could not tell them what. At minute 9, on the other side of the planet, Maya Reyes climbed the stairwell of a building that had lost its top 3 floors to alien plasma fire. Her squad was behind her, 5 Marines and a private named Torres, who was 19 years old and had joined the Corps 8 months ago, and was currently feeding her wind data from a weather app on his phone, because the actual wind measurement equipment was buried under what used to be the communications building. Ruth. She unslung the portable launcher, the one she was technically not certified on, and she settled it on her shoulder and looked through the sight at a Dravosi troop carrier hovering 200 meters away, a massive thing that hummed with a sound like a pipe organ played by someone who hated music. Wind, she said. Torres looked at his phone. 11 knots, northwest, he said, and his voice cracked on the second word, not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity of using a free weather app to direct fire against an alien spacecraft. And if he survived this, he was going to leave that app a 5-star review. Maya adjusted. She breathed out. She fired. The carrier dropped from the sky like a cathedral falling off a shelf, trailing smoke and sparks and pieces of itself that rained down on the base below with a sound like the world's worst wind chime. She rocked another round into the launcher. Not my first ugly Tuesday. Torres stared at her. He did not ask what that meant. He was learning that some things did not need to be explained. At minute 10, Grand Strategos Vaeltherin, last in a line of 4 generations of commanders who had dedicated their lives to the conquest of Earth, stood on the bridge of a flagship that was shaking with impacts and bleeding atmosphere from 3 hull breaches, and looked at a tactical display that was more red than anything else, and said the words that no Dravasi commander had ever said in 400 years of conquest across 11 star systems. Full retreat. His bridge crew froze. The tactical officer's forearms stopped moving. The navigation team looked up from their stations with compound eyes that reflected the red of the dying display. All ships, Vaeltherin said, and his voice was the flattest, emptiest thing on that bridge. Immediate withdrawal to deep space. All ships. No one moved. Now. He said. They moved the fleet, what was left of it, pulled away from Earth in a ragged formation that looked nothing like the geometric perfection with which it had arrived. Ships tumbling over each other to reach jump distance, engines flaring in the dark like the eyes of animals running from a fire. Vaeltherin stood at his display and watched the planet fall away beneath him. The holographic invasion plan was still running on the table beside him, The beautiful 11,000-page masterwork, still projecting its phases and timelines and probability curves over a battle that no longer existed, and he could not bring himself to turn it off. Turning it off meant it was over. Turning it off meant the century was over. He left it running. He watched Earth shrink to a dot, and then to nothing, and then to a memory that would keep him awake for the rest of his life. Within parameters, he said one last time. Silent. No one clicked their mandibles in agreement. The conclave chamber on the Dravosi homeworld was the oldest structure in their civilization, a vast domed hall carved from the black stone of their planet's deepest mountain, and it had stood for 6,000 years without a single crack in its walls, which the Dravosi took as proof that careful planning could defeat even time itself. Vale Tharin stood at the center of this chamber, under the eyes of 17 elders, whose combined age exceeded 1,000 years, and he delivered his report on the invasion of Earth with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing how the patient died on the table. He began with the numbers. We deployed 12,000 vessels, he said. We lost 4,206 in the engagement. An additional 912 were damaged beyond operational capacity during the retreat. Total effective fleet loss, 42.7%. The elders did not move. Ground forces suffered 61% casualties within the first 8 minutes of contact. The electromagnetic suppression wave performed within expected parameters for the first 90 seconds before human forces began developing countermeasures. By minute 4, the suppression was functionally irrelevant in 38% of operational theaters. He paused. The invasion plan accounted for a 72-hour campaign. The engagement lasted 10 minutes. Silence in the chamber. The kind of silence that has weight and texture. The kind that presses against your exoskeleton and makes it hard to breathe. How, said the eldest of the elders, a creature so old her carapace had turned from black to gray, how is this possible? Vale Tharin had expected this question. He had spent the entire 4-month journey home preparing his answer, turning it over in his mind the way you turn over a stone you found in a riverbed, looking at it from every angle, knowing that it is not beautiful and not valuable, but it is the only true thing you brought back from a place that took everything else. We did not fail because our intelligence was wrong, he said. Our intelligence was correct. Every data point we gathered over 100 years was accurate. Every weapon system we cataloged was real. Every military installation we mapped was where we said it was. Every behavioral pattern we observed was genuine. He let that sit. We failed because the species we invaded was not the species we observed. The elders shifted. A rustling of chitin and confusion. Explain, said the gray elder. Vale Tharin stepped forward. For 100 years we watched them from a distance. We watched them fight each other, and we concluded they were fragmented. We watched them waste resources on irrational pursuits, and we concluded they were undisciplined. We watched them build weapons capable of destroying their own world, and we concluded they were self-destructive. Every conclusion was logical. Every conclusion was supported by evidence. And every conclusion was wrong. His voice changed here. Not louder, not softer, but different in a way the elders could feel in their antennae. The humans we observed were humans at rest. Humans in peacetime. Humans in the absence of an external threat. They fight each other because they have energy that must go somewhere. They build irrational things because their minds cannot stop reaching. They are undisciplined because discipline is a cage, and this species does not tolerate cages, not even cages of their own making. He paused again. When we arrived, we did not meet the humans we had studied. We met what humans become when something threatens their home, and those are two entirely different organisms. The chamber was very still. They did not need to be organized because the threat organized them. They did not need to communicate because They already knew what needed to be done. They did not need orders, because every single one of them, from the soldier to the civilian to the child, broadcasting on a gaming network, made the same decision independently and simultaneously. What decision? The Grey Elder asked. To fight, Veiltharin said. Not to win. They did not know they could win. They decided to fight before they knew the outcome. And that is the thing we cannot model. That is the variable that breaks every simulation, because our models assume rational actors making calculated decisions based on probability of success. And humans do not fight because they have calculated that they can win. Humans fight because something in their biology, something older than language, something we do not have and cannot replicate, refuses to stop. He looked at the elders one by one. They are not a civilization. They are an immune response. The act of attacking them is what activates them. Weapon we deployed made them stronger. Every advantage we pressed made them more creative. Every minute we stayed gave them another minute to adapt. And they adapt faster than any species we have ever encountered. Not because they are smarter, but because they are willing to try things that should not work. And sometimes those things work anyway. And then they build on that and try something else that should not work. And it works too. And this chain of irrational improvisation compounds on itself until you are fighting something that did not exist 5 minutes ago. The eldest shifted on her platform. Then we must build new models, she said. We must study them longer, another century perhaps. We must account for these variables and— You do not model them, Veiltharin said. The interruption was a violation of protocol that had not occurred in this chamber in 600 years. Every elder stared. You do not model them, he said again. They are not a system. They are a reaction. Every model you build, they will outgrow before you finish building it. Every weapon you design, they will adapt to before you finish deploying it. You could study them for 1,000 years, and you would be less prepared than we were, not more. Because 1,000 years from now, they will be something that does not yet exist, something we cannot imagine, something that they themselves cannot imagine, until the moment it becomes necessary, and then it will exist as if it always had. The Grey Elder leaned forward. Then what do you recommend, Strategos? Do not go to the third planet of the Sol system, he said. Leave it alone. Leave them alone, and hope that they do the same for us. The chamber fell into a silence so deep, it seemed to have a color. It was the Grey Elder who spoke last. And if they come to us— Veiltharin did not answer. He did not need to. Understood what his silence meant. 7,000 light-years away, on a planet with scars in its sky, and smoke still rising from a dozen cities, Sergeant Maya Reyes sat on the hood of a burned-out Humvee, and watched the sunset through an atmosphere streaked with re-entry burns that turned the western sky into something that looked like a painting done by someone who was angry and talented in equal measure. She had been sitting there for 20 minutes. She had not moved. A corporal she did not recognize walked up to her with a paper cup of coffee and held it out without saying a word. And she took it without saying a word. And he walked away without saying a word. Because sometimes that is all the language a moment needs. The coffee was terrible. It tasted like it had been made in a machine that had survived an alien invasion, which it had. And that made it the best cup of coffee she had ever held. Her phone buzzed in her vest pocket. Pulled it out. 1 bar of signal, which was a miracle considering the entire communications infrastructure of the western seaboard had been reduced to sparking wreckage 6 hours ago. But somebody somewhere had gotten something working again, because somebody somewhere always did. Text from her sister. You okay? Maya looked at the sky, at the scars that would fade over the next few weeks as the atmosphere healed itself, because atmospheres do that. They heal. They always heal. That is what they are built to do. She typed back. Yeah, weird day. She sent it. She sipped the terrible coffee. Somewhere above her, in the cold and the dark, and the vast indifferent emptiness between stars, the Dravasi Deep Space Communication Network was transmitting Vale Theron's report to every known species in the galaxy, a standard protocol that had existed since the first Dravasi conquest, designed to inform allied civilizations of newly claimed territories. This transmission was different. This transmission was a warning. It propagated outward at the speed of light, touching relay stations and listening posts and diplomatic channels across 11 star systems. And every species that received it read the same assessment, the same conclusion, the same 2 sentences that Vile Tharan had added to the end of his report in a moment of something that was not fear exactly, but was certainly not courage. Do not go to the 3rd planet of the Sol system. They are awake now, and they know they are not alone. One by one, 11 species received this message. One by one, 11 species locked the Sol system out of their star charts. Not out of anger, not out of strategy, not even out of fear exactly, though fear was part of it, the way salt is part of the ocean, present in every drop, but not the thing you notice first. They locked it out of respect. The kind of respect you give to a thing you do not fully understand, but know with the certainty of instinct you do not want to test. Maya finished her coffee. She crushed the cup. She slid off the hood of the Humvee and stood on a planet that had been invaded and liberated in the time it takes to soft-boil an egg. And she stretched her back and picked up her rifle and walked toward the sound of voices, toward the people who were already rebuilding, already arguing, already doing the 1,000 irrational, beautiful, stupid things that humans do when the dust settles. The sky above her was scarred but clearing. It would heal. It always did.